Thank you. That's it, sir. Thank you.
The blue form.
It's my honor and pleasure to introduce our next speaker in the series of speakers about the social change implications of 9/11. His name is Robert Rabin. Robert is a writer, speaker, and spiritual activist. Robert is a lifelong mystic whose youthful search for truth led him to India, where he met Swami Muktananda, with whom he studied for 10 years. Robert is the author of numerous books and articles. This particular book here, Invisible Leadership, is a marvelous book on leadership, one of his, I think, 5 books, had a big impact on me. Robert is the author of numerous books, articles, and he's the creator of truthforpresident.org, an online spiritual activism resource that provides inspiration, tools, and information for people from all traditions to express themselves politically. Robert, come on up, and we're eager to hear what you have to say on the topics of the day.
My talk will be very light on information and evidence. Only befitting a lifelong mystic, I suppose. One of my favorite quotes is from Byron, who said, "Every community needs a group of angelic troublemakers." I can see that you are all the angelic troublemakers of your respective communities, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to add my thanks also to Stephen and Byron and Ken and everyone else in this room and in rooms across the country that have convened such meetings and inquiries into truth. And I especially want to mention and appreciate Byron's earlier elevation of the spiritual element of today, speaking of spirit and soul and providing 2 beautiful rooms upstairs, sanctuaries of silence and inwardness and revelation. From the time I was 11, I realized that I need silence to exist. I need silence to breathe. I need silence to see and to hear and to think, and mostly I need silence to feel. From the time I was 11, I lived both literally and metaphorically in the room upstairs, the sanctuary of silence. And it has only been in the last 3 years, since September 11th, 2001, that I was compelled to leave that room and that sanctuary of silence and come back into the world that I had left a long time ago. And I'll be quite honest, it's difficult, which is why I particularly appreciate the organization of this program, with the poetry, with the songs, with the constant reference to silence and spirit and soul and a higher vision, even as we deal with things that are almost unbelievable. Here we are looking at the possibility that elements of the federal government knew about or were complicit in the events of 9/11. I cannot get over being amazed at that. Not amazed as in denial, but amazed as in my world, such a thing is unthinkable. But I no longer live in that world. I have brought that world down these stairs into this world where these things apparently go on. Stephen asked me to speak about higher consciousness and social change. He asked me to say a few things about how to bring consciousness and love into political activism so that it reflects our spiritual path. So I love doing this because I happen to agree with former President of the Czech Republic, Václav Havel, who said, without a global revolution in the sphere of human consciousness, nothing will change for the better. And the catastrophe towards which this world is headed, whether it be ecological, social, demographic, or a general breakdown of civilization, will be inevitable. The philosopher J. Krishnamurti said it even more succinctly: the crisis is not out there in the world, it's in our own consciousness. And it seems to me that whatever else we might propose to affect positive social change, if it is not supported by, informed by, and led by the wisdom of silence, it will not work. It will not take. It will have no traction. My personal view is that if we have only this, if we have only this higher mind and this vision and this wisdom and love and compassion born of silence, then whatever else we do is sure to work. A couple of days ago, I started looking ahead, sort of leaving the now, which, you know, as a mystic you're not supposed to do, but I come and go. Thinking what I might say, and I did what I normally do, which is go into silence. And there was a number of possibilities that came, but one of them stood out and remained brighter than the rest, and it took my attention, and it was to read from something I wrote only days after 9/11/2001. I don't normally like to read from texts, and certainly not something that was 3 years old, but I couldn't seem to shake this notion that I should do this. So whenever I get overruled like that, I move ahead with the marching orders. I went and I looked at the piece, which was 6,000 words. It would take about an hour and 15 minutes to read, and I started editing it. And I was up till about 2:30 this morning, editing it down to about 1,700 words. So I'm going to read that. It contains the essence of my thoughts about this notion of higher consciousness and social change. And while the thrust of what I'm going to read are about events and feelings inspired by 9/11, I think they're also pertinent to a whole range of social diseases that we might want to cure. It came to me as an extended meditation. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, and I went into my room and spent a couple of days and wrote this piece. So I'm going to take this abridged version and offer it to you as a meditation, and as I read, invite you to really relax and sink into your chair, close your eyes even, breathe deeply, rest and open, and listen to these words. But if these words inspire something in you from your depths, then I would urge you to stop listening to me and begin listening to yourself. Since the shattering morning of September 11th, we have all tried to understand, how could this happen here? Who did this? What do we do? I would like to speak to these questions, even with the knowledge that my words can neither encompass nor illuminate the whole truth of these events. Nonetheless, I hope that my words may contribute in some measure to a healing of wounded hearts, to a search for truth, and most of all, to a resolve for nonviolent action. It is a universal human experience that suffering, tragedy, and even death can awaken us from the surface of life to its depths, from the superficial to the meaningful, from the selfish to the selfless, and from the mundane to the transcendent. In this awakening, we are drawn towards deep reflection and inner silence in a search for wisdom. And now, in this moment of escalating passions and convictions, we must give ourselves to this silence, for it is in this silence that we find the true heart and spirit, the true soul of our common humanity. Here, in our common humanity, we must come together and stay together. From the highest expression of our common humanity, we must now choose what to do. In the simplest of terms, our choices are between violence and nonviolence, between hatred and understanding, between falsehood and truth, between aggression and restraint. Before we choose one of these paths, we must reflect and learn. In order to learn, we have to empty our mind of the things we already know and come to rest in the silent essence of our common humanity. Beyond our thoughts and words, beyond our concepts and beliefs, beyond what we know and imagine is this silence, that sacred place within each of us where all differences dissolve, where all conflicts cease, where all fear turns to love, where all souls shine with the same single flame of radiance. Silence will teach us what we must learn. Right now, we can scarcely confront, let alone accept, the enormity of our pain and suffering. We do not know what to do with our unbearable emotions, with our helplessness and fear and anger and sorrow and grief. Silence teaches us that we must not only bear our unbearable emotions and sadness, but also enter them fully and with eyes and hearts wide open, feeling and seeing them to their very depths. In this way, we can touch the universality of suffering. We will come to feel the starkness of human suffering without the rationalizations of flags and national anthems. As we struggle to bear the sorrows of our own recent devastation, we must understand that all people throughout the world struggle with the same devastation of violence and war. Such is the daily bread of most of the world. In this moment of our personal and national grief, we must find the courage to see not just the mangled bodies in New York and Washington, but to see also the mass graves and mounds of mangled bodies everywhere. If we are willing to truly see and feel the world suffering, not just our own, then we will end war now and for all time. If we can see the madness of war stripped of justification, then we will accept only peace because the tragedies of war will be unendurable. This is why we must now gather all of the world's sorrow and add it to ours, because the weight will break our hearts. With broken hearts and unbearable sorrow, we will no longer be willing to tolerate war and violence, and we will call for peace, and we will accept only peace. The magnitude of humanity's suffering may seem too much to face, especially at this moment, but we must. The world is small, and we all share a single table. We all share the same meal. We cannot have peace at one end of the table and not the other. Here and there are the same place. We cannot enjoy wealth here if there is no wealth there. We cannot be safe here if there is no safety there. We cannot be free here if there is no freedom there. We do not live in separate houses, in separate countries, in separate cities. This is an illusion. The suffering in our world is beyond calculation. Hundreds of millions of people cling tenuously to life, displaced, malnourished, starving, brutalized, raped, imprisoned, tortured, and slaughtered. All fingers point blame at someone else. Are we not ready to end it? We have no choice but to call for peace, and so we must find peace within ourselves. We must know peace, and we must become peace. We must find everything within us that is not peace and turn it into peace. We must breathe peace into every cell of our body, into every synapse of our brain, into every strand of our soul. If we do not know how, we must find a way. We know how to wage war, but now we must do something else, something we have never done. We must accept another challenge, one that might seem almost foolish in its daring. Our challenge is to meet violence with nonviolence, to meet war with peace, to meet fear with love, to meet hatred with compassion. We may not know how to do this, but we can find a way if we only resolve with our whole heart and spirit to do so. It is said that mother is the necessity of invention. It is said that necessity is the mother of invention. It is now necessary to choose peace. If violence is not an option, what will we do? This is our challenge. We have been asked to sacrifice much for the sake of our freedom. What exactly shall we sacrifice for freedom? The wisdom of silence teaches us to sacrifice war, hatred, and violence. Wisdom teaches us to sacrifice fear and ignorance. Wisdom teaches us to sacrifice the conditions that give birth to hopelessness, despair, and suffering. Wisdom also teaches us that we must never sacrifice a peaceful heart, a steady and quiet mind, or a compassionate spirit. Nor must we sacrifice civil liberties, human rights, a government accountable to its people, or due process of law. These are hallmarks of a peaceful people and of a peaceful society. Wisdom also teaches us that an immutable law of human existence is what goes around comes around. In years past, as the United States has pursued its ideological, political, and economic interests, our government has sold pieces of our national soul. We have made dubious alliances. We have made secret deals. We have undertaken covert actions of violence and terrorism. We have intruded violently into other countries without regard for their sovereignty and human rights. In every case, we have left behind the angry ghosts of those we have terrorized and killed. And now these angry ghosts have come to our shores for their day of justice. All actions find their way home, and no amount of justification, rationalization, or denial can change this. These stories must be told if we are to end the cycle of violence. We must speak of these things in order to learn what wisdom teaches us about higher laws to which we are all subject. We must listen to the angry ghosts of our past actions so that we can understand how their agony has become ours. We must look clearly and honestly to the past as well as to the present to acknowledge and admit our role in world violence. Of course, we want to believe that America is a beacon of freedom and democracy and that our violence is justified and righteous. We believe God is on our side, but everyone believes God is on their side. If we are to invoke the name and power of God, we must see things as God sees them. We enter God's kingdom through silence and humility, and as we enter, we must shed all our separating labels and loyalties. God has never heard of Americans or Iraqis, of Israelis or Palestinians. God has never heard of Christians, Jews, or Muslims. God does not bless one and not the other. God does not have enemies. In God's kingdom, might does not make right, it only makes angry ghosts. The true cause of terrorism is a wound that is cut deep into our collective soul. The Indian poet Kabir wrote, "We sense that there is some sort of spirit that loves birds and animals and the ants, perhaps the same one who gave a radiance to you in your mother's womb. Is it logical you would be walking around entirely orphaned now? The truth is you turned away yourself and decided to go into the dark alone. You have forgotten what you once knew, and that's why everything you do has some weird failure in it." If we want to end terror, we must remember what we once knew. This is why we are called to silence, because in this silence we remember the spirit that loves all of creation. In this silence we find the higher consciousness of our common humanity. In this silence we feel the suffering of all people, and we vow to end it. We can end violence. It will be a miracle, yes, but creation itself is a miracle, and we have within us that power of creation. This is what Rumi meant when he said, "Let the beauty you love be what you do." Thank you.
So just stretch in your seat. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, Robert Rabin. Thank you, Robert. We're going to have a little stretch break, and after the stretch break, we're going to have our panel. We decided to move that up. So if you can stretch in place, we'll get assembled here for the panel. Stay with us.
Material opened up, and just by there was a little mini session happening outside with Jim, so we kind of want to bring that back inside and continue that dialogue. So let's go straight to questions, and let's ask them as succinctly as possible.
I have a question. You alluded to the Oklahoma bombing and the real story behind that, and I would like to know about that. And also, if you have any information about the fellow that was had an accident, who was the one that discovered how to do a paper trail with the deep old machines in Ohio. Do you know anything about that?
I'm afraid I do not know any more information on Timothy McVeigh and the Oklahoma City bombing. I know that the debulk machine, as was discussed this morning, are highly problematic. If you saw Howard Dean on television about 3 or 4 weeks ago, he had a woman on that in very short order, between commercial breaks, broke in, into a debulk machine and manipulated the numbers, changing the numbers of 400 to 600 right in front of your eyes. And she did it very straightforward. So it's clear that there's very little security, and it's also clear that the people who are putting these machines out are very right-wing, very well to the public interest. Again, as I indicated before, for whom democracy is an impediment to effective governance.
Just one quick comment on Oklahoma City. I happened to have been in Oklahoma City when the bombing occurred. I was working for a software company there, and I would just add this comment. When you're that close to a terrorist incident, it is extremely transformative spiritually. For 2 weeks, the whole city was just eye contact, hugs, doors open, everywhere you went, banks, wherever you went, everybody was just receiving and hugging, and it was an astounding, life-changing experience there. Also, Jim Morris has a good deal to say about Oklahoma City if you want to ask him. So.
Hi, I want to thank you all for your great talks. Jim, in particular, I was inspired by what you were saying, and want to throw out an idea that I think maybe differs. You were talking about this next election being of crucial importance, which I wouldn't argue. But the implication I got is maybe if we get Bush again, we're kind of toast. Could be really, really bad news. And the idea I'd like to entertain is that Bush, in a way, has done us this huge favor. He's been the most powerful force for progressive politics, I think, ever, because he's waking the American people up. He's making things so bad and so terrible and so horrible that people are noticing what's been going on all along. And in that sense, I think if we get him reelected, it's because we need that to wake up more, and it's not necessarily the horrible thing that on the surface it might seem.
Yeah, I would like to very respectfully, fundamentally disagree. What can I say? It's democracy. And I want to take a moment on this because I think the point that you're making is true. And as a philosopher who believes in antinomies, I know that the opposite of a great truth is not necessarily a falsehood, but can be an equally great, just different truth. So it's true that what Bush has done is activate the progressives in ways that it hasn't been before. But what also is true is the parallels to the 1930s. And let me just tell you a quick little story, if I may, Byron. This will take a few minutes, it'll be about 4 minutes, but it stopped my life. Because I was lecturing because of the book, America's Empire. And I was saying to people around the country, this is a critical, important thing, and the only historical analogy for the present moment is the 1930s. Same politics of fear, same everything. And if you read the 1930s, the parallels are scary. And I was at a talk, and at the end of the talk, there was a lot of discussion about this analogy to the 1930s and so forth. And then an old woman got up, and she said, first thing she said was, "I'm Jewish. I was in Vienna during the Anschluss. I went with my family to hear Adolf Hitler in the Great Plaza, and we all cheered because we considered ourselves Germans. And when we went to school the next day and they told us that the little girls, all the Jewish little girls, had to go to the back of the class, we thought, that's not so bad. We can do this. These Austrians are good people. Hitler was an Austrian. He was a civilized man." Then a couple of weeks later, when they said we had to put the yellow Star of David on our lapels, we thought, we can do this. The Austrians, the Germans, they're civilized people. We're Germans, we're Austrians, we're law-abiding Austrians. We pay our taxes. And she says the reason why 6 million of us went into the gas chambers is because we kept believing that these were civilized people that in the end really wouldn't do anything outrageous. And she said there was great controversy among us Jews, particularly when we were all corralled into ghettos, between those that kept saying, listen, you got to get out. These guys are going to kill us. And the other great divide, mostly the older Jews, that said, well, we've been here a long time, we've been through anti-Semitism, we can survive this one too. They didn't. And then the woman said, for the last 18 months, I've been telling my family, it feels to me like it felt in the 30s. Wow. It's the same politics of fear. It's the same incremental erosion of civil liberties. It's the same manipulation of the media. It's the same big lie. I mean, you know you're dealing with big lie techniques when the war hero from Vietnam is turned into a wimp. And the guy who deserted because of his daddy's connections is turned into the great Mr. Macho. That's what Goebbels called the big lie. That's what the Bush administration is so good at. So I understand that he's raising the contradictions. And as someone who read Mao's Little Red Book in the 60s and memorized great chunks of it as we were all running around with a knife between our teeth, I know about that contradiction. But the opposite is also true. And that is that if the people don't rise up as an ocean, said Mao, whatever is heightening the contradiction then consolidates power in monopoly capitalism and fascism. And when I look at the American electorate, and I've been in 35 cities around the country in the last 3 or 4 months, most people are pretty sleepy out there. And most people are either sedated by the consumerism. They kind of feel a vague unease. You know, the polls show that 70% of the American electorate have an unease. They believe the country's going in the wrong direction. But when asked, are you going to support John Kerry or George W. Bush, upwards of 50% of them are supporting George W. Bush. And I believe that, like the 1930s, we're at a watershed. Remember, Hitler was democratically elected in 1932. And if we, with the full knowledge of everything they've done, elect George W. Bush, they're going to assume a mandate. And I think we have to be really careful about it. And within this context, finally, I would take, again, very respectful issue with what Jim Marrs said. I don't believe we're in a situation of Tweedledee and Tweedledum for a moment. I know John Kerry's no angel, but in 2000, we were all seduced into thinking it was Tweedledee and Tweedledum between Gore and Bush, and what we've discovered in the last 3.5 years, it wasn't. This guy was a mean-spirited man. And it's like a friend was saying in the discussion outside, it's like if you're going into the iceberg and you're on the Titanic, and one guy is saying, full speed ahead, and the other guy is saying, hey, let's slow down here. That's a real choice. So Kerry's not perfection, but I would just remind all of you who are either libertarian or thinking about Ralph Nader, remember in politics, the perfect is often the enemy of the good. And we just need, this is not an election where we can mess around and every single vote counts. In fact, the good guys have to vote twice because of the D-ball machines.
Just a quick addition. A quick addition, just by way of metaphor. We're here to celebrate the fact that we're able to look at the shadow. We're facing the shadow in this room, and throughout the country, progressives are facing the shadow. There's a lot of people in denial of the shadow. You can have a neurotic person who's beginning to have insight about this inner darkness, but at a certain point, it rolls over to psychosis. And I agree with Jim Garrison about that. This election is about a rollover to a monstrous acting out of the shadow. And I agree that this is crucial to understand for us. That's why we've got 6 weeks to work on this. And in culminating this conference, I'd like to initiate a conversation for building the 9/11 truth movement in the broadest base possible in light of what was just said.
I think I agree with everybody. And I would like to put in the pot also something that I've noticed in 35 years of studying my own mind, which I'm guessing is kind of like everybody's mind. Whenever I say something with passionate certainty, I can't help but notice that in some strange way, it blinds me to an awareness of that realm which is unknowable by anything we have other than our own largeness.
Next question.
Yes, some of your comments actually feed into what I'm going to say. I don't know if this is symbolic or what, but the flag just fell. You were just talking about the shadow and recognizing the shadow. And I offer this with respect and gentleness, and I hope that it's taken this way. Part of the shadow has to do with the male proclivity to using force and violence and for the love of control and power. And I think that has to be addressed, and that's part of the social transformation. That's part of the consciousness transformation. That part has to be recognized and then forgiven. And then I think we as a species can then move on in a more transcendent level. But of course it hasn't been addressed here, and nor do I rarely hear it addressed in a public forum. And just, of course, the amount of males that have been addressing this forum is also indicative of that. If you would like to comment on that.
How about if I start and I'll hand it down the row. In recognition of the very valid point you're making, we decided to have a sacred space upstairs, which is administered by men and women. And in one of the rooms is, front and central, is a depiction of the goddess, the Holy Mother Spirit. And that's one way that we're trying to balance out those energies for the conference. And I hope that that becomes a model for future conferences of this kind.
I would make one addition to the remarks, and that is, I think if you remember back about 100 years, one of the essential arguments of the suffragettes as they were trying to get the vote is that if you give women the vote, you're going to end war. The 20th century, after women got the vote in America and across Europe and in many parts of the world, was the bloodiest century in recorded history. My understanding of the shadow is it has as much to do with women as it has to do with men. The shadow is a very subtle dimension that has to do with light, not gender. It has to do with the dark recesses of the human psyche. And if you know your Jungian depth psychology well enough, Jung said that it's the paradox is the shadow are all the contents in our personalities that we don't own. But it is only by going through your shadow, the gateway to which is the feminine impulse, that you begin the path of individuation that leads to wholeness. So I would take, as a North American white male that's done a lot of damage to the planet in the course of the last several centuries, that we males need to own it, our shadow content. But I also think that every woman in this room, every child in this room, every old person in this room, every conscious entity needs to understand that to be human is to have a shadow, and that we all have to grapple with it together.
Medea will be up soon.
And by the way, Medea Benjamin's here and will be speaking right after the panel.
I wanted to actually add a footnote to that. Just a very brief reframing. We have tried to diversify organizationally with more women and men, but it's funny, a lot more men seem to have been drawn to the early stage of this work, and I see it as partly an expression of that, the sort of sacred warrior impulse, finding a kind of healthy expression in a way, in bringing back balance. And so this can be an actual expression of the healthy masculine as well. So next question, please.
My question's a little long, but throughout listening to this whole thing, it's made me really think it really relates to what you're doing. Basically, I don't know if you're aware of the concept of intellectual pride, but I think it's been something that's been instilled into this society by a lot of different people as a way of controlling people. And it's basically just the idea that you're always right, you know the truth you have is the most pristine, clear, and perfect one. And that by extrapolating this principle, you can effectively control the majority of the intellectual and political segments of a society by giving them a series of truths, each one more true and harder to obtain than the one before. Then when one who prides themselves at intellectual superiority uncovers a new truth, their pride bloats, and they enter a state of mind where they refuse to accept anything which runs counter to their view, i.e. a higher truth, often leading them to attack the opposing point. A perfect example of this is when I try to talk about Inside Job, the most common response I get from people is, have you seen or you need to see Fahrenheit 9/11? I've actually found that overcoming the barrier of intellectual pride has been far more difficult than even the sheer disbelief that the government could possibly kill their own people. And moreover, in the speech, you've made a lot of indirect references to it, like if you want people to believe that 9/11 was set up, don't debate the melting point of the towers. Say, did you know the third building was collapsed? And you've never even heard of that, because that basically just shatters the person's own illusion of intellectual pride. And then you can also make a whole case with the entire information on the Pentagon being shown. So basically, I have two really simple questions. The first one is, have you thought about this, and what are your thoughts on the whole issue of intellectual pride? But much more importantly, how on earth do you overcome it when you want to try to tell people about this, or you just doom yourself to being considered a second-tier version of Fahrenheit 9/11? I think I phrased that all right.
Well, I would just comment that you're making a very profound observation, and if you remember the Genesis account of creation, at the core of the fall, however you define it, was hubris, intellectual pride. And that in the ancient Hebrew understanding was at the essence of the infection in the world that is called wickedness or sin or human cruelties or injustice or exploitation. And that it's not because of ignorance, as many traditions believe. It is that you do know, but in your pride, you decide that the end justifies the means. So I think you're pointing to a very profound defect in the human psyche that we have not yet been able to overcome. And in terms of talking to people, I don't know. Again, I would defer to other people who've had more experience than I, but I come back to what I ended with in my remarks, that the truth will set you free. How many times in your life have you argued against somebody and you've known that they were correct, but the more they make their assertion, the harder you argue. But then you go away, and then the next day you're arguing with somebody else and you're taking their position against the other guy. So there's a mysterious quality around truth. And I think that it's happening in this conference. You know, there's a small group of Americans that are saying there's a deeper truth to 9/11. And when you take it out there, you may seem like a fool. You may be considered a fool. But if it's the truth that you're enunciated, it has its own power independent of you. And that's why it sets people free.
I think once a thought becomes a word, we have the difficulty that you're speaking about. Everybody is always right. If we can learn to recognize what a belief is as it exists within the mind, not by definition, but by direct investigation, and understand the inherent limitation and bias of all language-based communication, in order to get to a place of truth that is not conditioned by belief, we could use what Socrates said many years ago, which is the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think if we can begin, especially in the presence of passion and conviction and certitude, to bring the spirit of honest and deep questioning, even to the assumptions of our own certainty, we can do two things. One, we can get closer to the truth, and two, we can get closer to each other.
The notion of intellectual pride is the notion that I already know. I already have the answer. It's my hope that the inquiry we have here has not come across as we already know, we already have the answer. I hope that in future forums like this we can keep the inquiry open. Open these mics to all kinds of questions and considerations. One other point. Intellectual pride in the academic elites of this country and Western civilization is a first step toward supporting a superstructure which eventually falls and becomes corrupt, where the issue becomes something far bigger than intellectual pride, and that is a corruption of a war system that's supported for the sake of profit and even more base motives than intellectual pride.
We're running a little short on time, so if we could have maybe 3 questions, but not answered by every panelist, if you can just direct to one particular person you'd like to hear from.
Okay, then this one will be for Jim Garrison. I just have a question about some of the shadow forces that seem to, for many of our earlier speakers, have been operating around 9/11. And it seemed like, I think you referred briefly to the fact that it seemed like it was a lot bigger than the Bush administration, and sort of, I don't know if that was what you meant by your comments, but certainly some of the earlier speakers were talking about that. And so, you know, if in some ways Bush is sort of even a puppet of this larger kind of, not even just American, but darker shadow force, how will removing Bush from office necessarily, like, will that really do the trick to start to really change things? And also sort of in light of the fact that, you know, it seems like Kerry in many ways is part of the same skull and crossbones society. He led an investigation for the bank scandal under the earlier Bush administration. So it seems like, you know, is it really going to do the trick to just get Kerry in office? That's going to be our great solution, or are these larger forces something that, like, how do we deal with that?
That's a great question. And because of the constraints of time, I can't honor it. Let me make just 2 quick points. And the first is, I think there's always in history an interaction between the river and the drop. And what I was seeking to convey about the United States is that we've reached our apex. And because we've reached our apex, we're going to experience, inevitably, a concentration of power, the rise of an aristocracy and a lower class, the evaporation of the middle class, and a pervasive corruption that will, in time, cause our fall. That's an inevitability. But within that context, there are all kinds of permutations that ensue out of the interaction of human will with the inevitabilities of history. And I believe that George W. Bush has come into office in a very concerted way at the moment of supreme American power, with a very clear agenda around the consolidation of military force around the world. That's what's happening. That is Afghanistan, that is Iraq. They're gearing up for Iran. I mean, you can see what their game plan is. And in fact, a little quick vignette of a friend of mine whose wife works in Donald Rumsfeld's personal office in the Pentagon. They were brought out. I mean, he got his small team together the week before Iraq. And he said, just want everybody to know, everything's on schedule. And after Iraq, it's going to be Iran. And this administration, if given 8 years, is going to eliminate Syria, Iraq, Pakistan, and Iran in the Middle Eastern area. And then North Korea, they're going to take care of. And that's the game plan, and They're just waiting for the election to be over before they do it.
For
The other
oil,
thing,
is that the...
the other thing that's going to happen is the weaponization of space. If we elect them, there's going to be a concerted attempt on the weaponization of space. General Myers, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, is the military's leading specialist on weaponization. Now, John Kerry is a different person. The most important fact about John Kerry is that he went to Vietnam. He was a war hero, got about a dozen medals, has shrapnel in his leg today. He thought about it and said, my God, this is wrong, and had the intellectual integrity and the courage not only to change his mind, but in the spirit of that last question about raising the contradictions, he came back, got involved. I was at the University of Santa Clara. I heard him speak with Jane Fonda. I heard him describe the butterfly bombs. He went to the Senate and gave testimony. He became a prosecutor. He got into the U.S. Senate. In the last 18 years in the U.S. Senate, he's had a more liberal voting record than even Ted Kennedy.
So you vote for John Kerry?
Absolutely, I would vote for John Kerry, and I would vote for John Kerry knowing that the perfect is the enemy of the good. He's not a perfect man, but he's a man that I believe will bring us back to a much more Clinton-esque situation where the United States will not be building a military apparatus around global consolidation. The United States will return to the two fundamental principles that have guided America for the last 100 years, and that is the extension of economic free trade zones.
But isn't there a shadow government
which has a real shadow side in and of itself, and I've written extensively on that, but it is not a military dictatorship that's being put in place, and it'll be back to consensual democracy within the UN, within the NATO alliance, and within the affairs of our international institutions. And so I think that there's a fundamental difference between John Kerry and George W. Bush. This country will be different if we elect John Kerry.
So just two more questions.
And you think he would have enough power to do that, even if there's these other forces that are...
Yeah, absolutely. I've dealt with a lot of major leaders, from Gorbachev to Jim Baker to George, and I'm telling you, it's not great forces that just sweep history along. It's the interaction of human choice. Leadership matters. Mikhail Gorbachev, when he became president of the Soviet Union in March of 1985, he could have just gone along, but he chose out of the integrity of his own heart to initiate perestroika and glasnost. He paid a high price. But he made a difference because when he ascended to the highest office of the land, he decided that his choice would interact with the forces, and he made a difference and he changed the world, and that's why he's honored the world over. Okay. So people matter, choices matter, leadership matters.
Okay, two final questions.
Quickly, my question's to Jim. My question comes from the assumption that we are going to fall, regardless of who is in the White House this election or in the future. Could you describe a little bit what that might look like?
2 minutes or less.
Yeah, in 2 minutes or less. Aren't these the questions you get like on your final exam? And you get an hour to write an essay? I would say the image that I put forward in the book is this. The ultimate irony of U.S. power in the world today is that right at the moment that we've become the strongest nation in history, history is moving beyond the nation state. If you look around the world today, there are between 20 and 30 major global problems that are confronting the human race. Ozone depletion, global warming, overfishing, deforestation, HIV/AIDS, organized crime, terrorism, water scarcity. You know there's more water refugees in the world today than war refugees.
We're at 2 minutes.
The challenge are vast. And I believe that we will be undermined if we perpetuate the current policies. What we're going to see over the next 5 to 10 years is an escalation of crises and catastrophes until something happens globally of the magnitude of a Second World War, but it will probably come from the environment. You just look what's just happening in Florida with 3 hurricanes in the world. That's an effect of global warming. The reason why we're having epidemics of infectious diseases, more tornadoes and earthquakes and storms and in the history of recorded history, is because we're not dealing with global warming. Why do we have terrorism? It's because we're not dealing with the massive poverty and alienation and social disequilibriums that exist all around the world. And if this country thinks that it can ride roughshod over the planet, ignore these problems, and build a national security state the world over in partnership with national security regimes, we, like ancient Atlantis, are going to be destroyed faster than we can possibly imagine.
All right. Final question. Final question, keep it short.
Have to keep it short. I think your question was very good about even if Kerry is elected, what do we do? Because the present global system is a war system, and the UN has been ineffective. I want to ask Jim and Byron a question having to do with if there's a shadow world government, if that's a fact. I put my energies into UN reform, a global people's assembly, and an Earth Federation under the Constitution for the Federation of Earth. I want to ask you two, because Jim believes that the solution can be, if I'm reading your book right, networking, and Byron believes we have to form a world federation, something bigger than the nations, something bigger than the multinational corporations. So would you two please comment on those differences in strategy? Thank you.
Go ahead, start.
My position is a complex one. I'll try to boil it down. And I'm happy to have this chance to say a few things that I didn't say in my talk, which is tactically what you and I can do now in regard to building planetary democracy. We can start now to actually become the constituency of a planetary democratic government by beginning to form international political parties, beginning to create an advisory world legislature, to actually elect delegates to this advisory world legislature, also called the People's Assembly, to begin to do it as they did in Europe. We now have something called the European Union, which is a federation of nations, which has its own parliament. The way they started in 1959 was by electing an advisory European parliament. It took them 20 years to get to a true parliament. We can do the same thing. We can start tomorrow the work that it takes to create a grassroots global parliament. And I urge you to join myself and others in that effort, which dovetails directly with what we're talking about here today.
As Byron mentioned earlier, we have an intellectual debate between ourselves. I believe that the solution is not government as a noun, but governance as a verb. And in that sense, I myself do not work for the creation of new superstructures around the planet. Although I admire what the Europeans have done in creating the European Union. And I think that there's certain internal factors inside Europe itself that are allowing them to do in Europe what the United States has done in North America. But whether we can do it at the level of the planet, I think ultimately it will be done, but it won't be done for centuries. I believe that the most important phenomenon in the world today that will be with us for at least the next century is globalization. Globalization is the coming together of the human race at almost every conceivable level of interaction. The net effect of globalization at the level of power is to deconstruct institutional power and empower individuals working together in voluntary networks. If you think, since this is 9/11, let's look at the essence of 9/11. You have a nation state in the last 3 years on a global manhunt against an invisible network. If you look at the power of the individual today, I know George Soros, the financier, quite well. 15 years ago, he made $1 billion in a single transaction by breaking the Bank of England. In 1997, the entire Southeast Asia finance market collapsed because of 25-year-olds with ice water in their veins, on Wall Street. The power of an individual right now with a computer and a telephone and through the internet is awesome. Osama bin Laden, the 23rd son of a wealthy Kuwaiti turned Saudi business magnate in construction, has basically declared war on the United States on behalf of the civilization of Islam. And it's by no means clear, my friends, who ultimately is going to win. Because globalization is disempowering the nation state. And the Bush administration is the last gasp of an elite that doesn't understand history. And what is going to constitute the future are voluntary networks like the 9/11 Convergence, like the NGO community, like all the work that you're doing locally and regionally and nationally. That is what we have to empower, because we can blow by the nation state if over the next 25 to 50 years we create a lattice work of networking around the world that is dedicated to the good and is dedicated to justice. And in the end, the institutions will either fall of their own weight or they will be reconstituted because of the pressure coming from the non-government organization community, of which we are all a part, which I've dedicated my entire professional life. The power of the people is a reality in today's world, and we have to actualize it in order to get the change that we all seek.
Great. That's it. Thank you to all the panelists for beautiful, fabulously insightful things. Next up, we're going to have some of the required women as requested. I would actually like Laura to come up and introduce Medea, partially to just because she just arrived and she was one of the architects of this conference and virtually everything else that happens in the progressive space.
Steve.
Laura has her fingers in it.
Excuse me.
No.
I need to make a comment. It's important. Everybody needs this good news I've got for you.
What good news?
First of all, I want to thank you for the great day that you just put on. And the challenge before all of us is to get the word out, of course. And then we're doing it by being here today to hear what people have to say. Right now, as we speak, I'm putting on TV here in Marin on Channel 26, Alex Jones, as he spoke in his documentary 9/11, The Road to Tyranny. And it occurred to me during the course of the day that one of the things that we can use to get the information out to people is community access television, which is free. All you have to do is take a tape in and they'll put it on. Television.
Okay.
You know somebody in another place.
Okay,
Excuse me, Steve. This is important.
No, Mike,
Yes,
actually, but we're kind of behind.
Steve,
We're
just
behind
a moment.
schedule.
Now,
Mike,
I heard
I'm
some
gonna-
good news
Sorry,
about
Mike,
what
but
happened
we
on
do need to move
TV
on
last night. Excuse me, Steve. That was on the Bill Moyers on the Now. Would you please tell us what you heard Bill Moyers say?
No. This isn't the moment.
Thanks to everyone for being here, and thanks for, I want to thank Ken Jenkins, actually, for... turning me personally and a lot of other people I know onto this over a year ago through Marin Peace and Justice Coalition, and all the work and the persistence you've had in this. Thank you. I first met Medea Benjamin when I joined Global Exchange, which, for those of you who don't know, is a rockin' kick-ass international world human rights organization that's doing the most amazing things. And then when they started an organization, I heard that she and some other women were going to do a 4-month vigil in front of the White House to protest going into Iraq before that happened. And I thought, that's pretty impressive. So I called and I said, how can I help? And I ended up going and being there for the week before International Women's Day, where we had 10,000 women and men marching in the streets trying to stop Bush from going into Iraq. And since then, I've been working with her and the other women. She's been doing this work for decades all around the world in lots of countries, teaching and lecturing and working hands-on with international collaborators to help social justice causes everywhere. But the most poignant memory I have at the moment, because I've just been in Boston at the Democratic National Convention and in New York at the Republican National Convention trying to have our voices heard, is a press conference we did that was a pink slip Bush press conference about the soldiers that have been killed and the people that have been killed in Iraq. And it was a peaceful protest, and right outside the protest zone, which, as I'm sure you all heard, was this big cage they had for free speech. You're only allowed to have free speech in the cage. So we were outside of the cage, and there were 4 police people, 4, that could not get Medea off this cage. She's like this on the cage, and I'm holding up the banner in the back, and she's saying, Bush lies, people died. Bush lies, people died. And I don't know anyone who has the combination of articulation skills, passion, and fierce just commitment to stay and do the job no matter what. My friend, Medea Benjamin.
Well, thank you very much, and it's wonderful the kind of organizing that's going on in Marin, and I think you've had an amazing schedule of events from last night and today, and the little I heard was wonderful. And I just want to sort of ramble a little bit, if you don't mind, because it is a day of a lot of reflection. And I'm a bit of a masochist. I don't know if any of you do this as well, but I oftentimes turn on Fox TV. Anybody else do it? Raise your hand. You know, sometimes I just feel I need a little bit of a dose of hearing what the so many other millions of Americans are hearing, just to kind of get in that mind space. And so I turned it on this morning, and they were reading off the names of the people who died on September 11th. And it was very heart-wrenching because the cameras kept going to the women in the audience who were crying. And the cameras would just stay on them for an excruciating long period of time to catch the grief and transmit that grief all over the country. Because this is the grief that the official powers that be want the American people to see and remember and feel, because that's the grief that then they turn into fear that they hope turn into votes. While that was happening, I was getting ready to go to a gathering of women whose sons were in the military. And just as I was ready to leave and turn off Fox News, they made the connection, and they said, here we have the 3,000 plus people who died on September 11th, and we have now the over 1,000 people who have died fighting the war on terror. And they made the connection as if it was part of the same thing, one smooth, big lie that they have been putting out. And then I went this morning to meet and be part of a ceremony that was totally unofficial, because the people who lost family members during this war, that is not a war on terror, that is a war for oil, that is a war for empire, that is a war for control of the Middle East. The grief of these families is the unofficial grief. They don't want the American people to feel or see or have to really get the depth of that grief. And so it is our grief, those of us unofficially who do care about the 1,000+ soldiers who have died. And I have come to care very, very deeply because in the last few years I have met so many people that have lost their sons, their daughters, their husbands, their wives. And there we were this morning at the unofficial grieving ceremony when Nadja McCaffrey from Tracy, California, came forward with a face full of grief and said, I am the one when my son came back in the flag-draped coffin that had the nerve to call the press and said to the press, even though it is not allowed, come. I want you to take pictures of my son coming back in that coffin. I want the American people to see that. I want them to see me crying and grieving and the agony of our family. I want the world to see those pictures. It was a totally unofficial thing to do. In fact, it was even illegal because the press is not allowed to come to Dover Air Force Base to take pictures of those coffins. Not allowed. Can you imagine that? And so unofficially, we have done that on other occasions. Gone with the families to Dover Air Force Base and stood outside the base and done our own ceremonies. And you might have seen, those of you who did see Fahrenheit 9/11 might remember Lila Lipscomb, who was in front of the White House crying and grieving. And she was there with us at Dover in the unofficial ceremony. And the police in front had the nerve to come up to these parents who lost everything that was meaningful to them in their lives and tell them they weren't allowed to stand there. And they said, take me away. You've already taken the most important thing in my life. Take me away. And of course, the police wouldn't do that. And there comes Lila Lipscomb forward, and she said, I remember when my son was 21, what a joyful time it was, and the birthday celebration that we had, and all the gifts that he got, and it was such a community and a family affair, his turning 21. And then he was sent off to Iraq, and there he died. And then it was his 22nd birthday, and what could we give him? A tombstone. No mother should have to give a tombstone to her child. And she went on and on about her suffering, her grief, because of the lies of the Bush administration. And this is the unofficial suffering that is going on every day in families in this country. And let us remember who these families are, because when it passed the 1,000 point just 3 days ago, some of the press started to look at who these families are. And they start to make the connections that we have made, the poverty draft, the people who go into the Army or into the reserves because they want a simple thing, a college education. And what does it say about the richest nation in the world that says to its young people, you want a college education? Go into the Army. Risk killing other people and risk being killed yourself. Because the cost of community college has doubled in the last 10 years and continues to go up with the budget deficits. Because we are spending on the war in Iraq 3 times the entire federal education budget, making it impossible for young people in this country to get an education. And so that is what we tell them to do. And then we tell people in the families along the border, oh, your family is not legally in the United States? Would you like to help them? Go into the military, and we will facilitate getting green cards for your family members. Luring people into the military. Cannon fodder for George Bush's war. And disproportionately is the Latino community that has suffered more deaths, proportionately, than any other ethnicity in this country. Disproportionately, they are being recruited. In fact, they are even going across the border to Tijuana to recruit people, cannon fodder for George Bush's war. This is the unofficial side, and the unofficial grief that goes on in families every single day. My son just wanted to get an education. My daughter just wanted to help the family. It is shameful what is happening. And it is shameful how this is being hidden from the American public. Because if the American public saw every day those grieving families, do you think they would applaud John McCain when he got up and he said we might be in Iraq for another 10 or 20 years? No, they would not. And what is happening to the Iraqis? The real hidden tragedy. We got a lot of calls from the press because we organized in the course of 48 hours after hearing that the 100th soldier had died. We organized about 1,000 vigils around this country in 48 hours. Pretty remarkable. I know you had one here in Marin. We had them all over the Bay Area. We had them all over the country in 48 hours. What does that say? And we got a number of press calls, and the press said, well, how many Iraqis have died? And we said, give me a break. You think the US government is counting the number of Iraqis? We, as people in the peace community, started an occupation watch center in Baghdad to try to do that, but we couldn't keep up. It was too many. We couldn't get all over the country to find all the people that were being killed by the US forces. We don't know. You go to one website and it says 11,000. You go to another one and it says 30,000. We don't know, but we know that it was way more than the people who were killed on September 11th. And we know that the vast majority of them are children, are women, are innocent civilians. And we also know that the US military has just destroyed the holiest city in Iraq, the city of Najaf. And I remember going to Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein and staying in a hotel where all these pilgrims were coming in from Iran, from Saudi Arabia, from all over, because Najaf is considered one of the holiest places in the whole Muslim world. It's Mecca, Medina, and Najaf. And we stayed in the same hotel where these women were totally covered except for their eyes. And we talked to them. And we could see their eyes shining because they were so happy that they were able now to come to Iraq and go to Najaf. It was a dream come true for them. And now the US has destroyed that city. It's as if some group had come in and destroyed the Vatican. And do the American people understand what we have just done? And how many generations of hatred towards the United States that will cause among millions and millions of people in the Muslim world? They have no understanding of that. And the US military took a break from Najaf and went back, leaving in Najaf, where they're killing the Shiites, the ones who were so oppressed by Saddam Hussein, took a break from killing Shiites and went back into Fallujah to continue the killing of the Sunnis. Fallujah, it's now the 6th day that we have resumed the bombing of Fallujah. Also started again bombing Samarra, that has been under siege for the last 3 months. Killing now again in the Sunni triangle. So here the US goes from killing Shiites to killing Sunnis to killing Shiites to killing Sunnis, and then says, but we have to stay in Iraq because otherwise the Sunnis and the Shiites would start killing each other. They don't need to. We are doing it for them. This is the tragedy that the American people don't see. How many of you know that there are 2 Italian young women who are being held right now? Well, you know more than the vast majority of Americans know because it has been hidden in this country. That now is the 4th day that 2 young women, 29 years old, 2 Simonas from Italy, have been kidnapped. And I know these women very well because they're part of our Occupation Watch Center and we have worked together. And in fact, they were determined to stay in Iraq when all the foreign workers were leaving, because they said, 1, we love the Iraqi people and we must stay here and continue to work with them, and the other, the kidnappers won't kidnap women. There goes that one. They've kidnapped women. And of course, Donald Rumsfeld did make a comment and say, these horrible people that do these horrible things, kidnap women, cutting people's heads off, so much worse than what we did in Abu Ghraib. Well, let me tell you, The reason they have kidnapped these women is that they are calling for the Iraqi women in the prisons to be released. And the story of the Iraqi women in the prisons is a story we have not yet heard, because the Iraqi women are so ashamed of what they have gone through at the hands of the U.S. occupiers that they will not publicly tell their stories. And the reason these two young, amazing, wonderful women are being held right now is the desperation to try to secure the release of the Iraqi women being held. Yes, people do terrible things when they feel desperate. And Iraqis are feeling desperate. They're desperate to get their own country back. They're desperate to get the jobs to rebuild their own country. And that's why so many contractors are being kidnapped, because they hate the contractors. They hate the foreigners who are coming in and taking their jobs and taking their oil money and giving it to the Halliburtons and the Bechtels and the U.S. contractors. They hate to see their money taken from them and given to foreigners that are not even capable of rebuilding their country. Of course, more and more Iraqis hate us today. And it is shameful what we are doing in that country. And it is shameful how it's being hidden from the American public. And I don't know how many of you read the Chronicle today, but I was almost in tears reading the analysis in the Chronicle that says that the war in Iraq might actually help George Bush in this presidential race. It is astounding what the American people don't know. It is astounding that they don't know that George Bush's war in Iraq has made us infinitely less safe. It is astounding that they can get away with saying, as Dick Cheney said, that if Kerry gets elected, we will be more likely to be attacked. Let us understand that the hatred towards Americans has grown infinitely since the invasion of Iraq, and that it will, unfortunately, take us decades to undo that. And the part of the way we undo that is by protesting as vociferously and vigorously as we can against the Bush administration everywhere we can. And that's why I think it was so important that we're at the Republican convention. And you know, the Democratic leadership told us not to go there. The Democratic leadership said, it will be bad for Kerry if you go to New York City and protest against the Bush administration, because the media will play it in a way that makes us look bad and makes Bush look good. And of course, the powers that be in New York City said, we will not give you Central Park to demonstrate because we don't want the grass to be hurt. And they said, don't come to New York because there is a code orange alert. And then others were saying, don't come to New York because the police are going to crack down on the demonstrators. Don't come, don't come, don't come, is what we heard. And yet 500,000 people came out in the streets on the Sunday before the convention to say no to the Bush administration, to say no to the Bush agenda, to say it loudly and clearly. And even though they wouldn't give us Central Park, we walked downtown through the streets of New York City, past the convention center, and then leisurely made our way down to the park anyway. We took back the public space, and we made our voices heard. And it is absolutely essential that we do that. And we did that every day during the convention, and we did it on the outside, and we did it on the inside. And let me tell you, I think it is absolutely essential to show that they are not as strong as they think they are, that they can have 10,000 people guarding that convention center, more than any other convention ever held in the history of the United States. And still, the women from Code Pink on Tuesday night, Wednesday night, and Thursday night were able to penetrate the inner sanctums of that convention. And we did it the first night when Arnold Schwarzenegger was speaking, the compassionate conservative, the happy face for the Republican Party, as he was justifying the invasion of Iraq. We unfurled our banner that said, "Be truly pro-life, stop the killing in Iraq." They did not like that. The first night they did not like that at all. They said, "We will make sure you will not get in here." The second night. The second night was when Dick Cheney was speaking. We had another group of women go in the second night. And when Dick Cheney started talking again about how safe we were by invading Iraq, this one very brave woman unfurled her banner that said, "Cheney is in bed with Halliburton and we got screwed," and started yelling out, "How much did you make in the war, Dick Cheney? How much has Halliburton made in the war? Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" And they were livid. The Republicans were livid, the Secret Service was livid, the New York PD was livid, and they said, "We will make sure that these women do not get into the convention when George Bush is speaking." And lo and behold, when George Bush started speaking, we let him go on for a long time. We waited till he started talking again about the invasion of Iraq and how good it was for us, the American people. And that's when we had two women pop up within 2 minutes of each other with pink slips on and banners that said, "Bush lied, people died." And so flustering George Bush that he had to stumble in his speech while people were interrupting in the audience shouting 4 more years in the middle of a sentence because they were trying to drown out "Bush lied, people died." And we feel very proud of ourselves that we were able to get inside the convention on all 3 nights. Because we think it is absolutely essential not only to say to the Republicans wherever we can see them and find them that they do not represent us, not only to say to the American people that we must unite despite our differences in politics and recognize there is one job ahead of us from now to November 2nd, and that is getting George Bush out of office. But perhaps most importantly is that we have a message to say to the global community. We are in bad trouble with the global community. Every poll that is taken says that in country after country, even in Canada, there is tremendous dislike for not only the Bush administration, but it rubs off on us as Americans. And we must show a different face of the American people to the international community. And every time I get ready to protest, and I get very nervous when I'm going in places like inside the Republican convention, thinking you're going to get eaten alive by these people, I think we need to show a different face to the global community. And I say it over and over and over again to myself, because that is one of the most important things we can do to make ourselves safer here at home. And when we send that message out to the global community, we get an amazing response, just like we did after going inside that convention. We at Code Pink have been getting responses from all over the world saying, "Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. We were afraid the American people were comatose. We need to see a little bit of life inside the United States. Thank you." And I want to read a message I got this morning from a dear friend in Iraq, who is somebody who has been working with us at the Occupation Watch Center, an Iraqi woman who has put her life on the line. She said, "First, I'm really sorry for the 2 Simonas who have been kidnapped. We are doing everything we can to try to get them released. But couldn't you help us on your end by stopping Donald Rumsfeld from justifying the torture of Iraqi people in Abu Ghraib? That would probably help to get these women released." Then she goes on to say, "Nobody is talking about all the deaths of Iraqis when you are mourning the 1,000 US soldiers. I don't see the US papers," because she calls them, "talking about the massacre that was just committed in Tel Afar on the Turkish border. We don't even hear about this in the US press." She said, many Iraqis have been killed, hundreds injured, their bodies have been left in the streets. And even Turkey, a coalition partner of the United States, has asked the American forces to please stop the bombing and let the humanitarian help go in. Samarra has been raided after 3 months of siege. Fallujah is being bombed daily. In the last month, thousands of Iraqis have been killed, injured, and forced to flee their homes. The majority of them are women and children. Yesterday, there was a huge explosion in our street. A bomb car attacked a Christian church. With all the problems we had under Saddam Hussein, this never happened. The Christians were able to go to church in peace. I went out there this morning, saw the glass blown out, the walls blown out, the doors blown apart. Yesterday, also the third building in our compound was hit by a mortar. I am afraid. I am afraid for my daughters. They have been traumatized by all the violence. Our streets aren't safe. We worry about them every day. We don't even want to let them go out to go to school. I want to send them to Syria so they can study. But we found out it would cost $3,000 a year, and we don't have that money. My older daughter, Kitaf, has a psychological problem. She's becoming very difficult. She has terrible nightmares every night. She sees fires, killings, and rape. She was crying this morning because of the same dream over and over and over. If I send a description of her nightmares, could you find someone in the US, a psychiatrist, who could advise me what I can do? I am desperate. P.S. I was watching the Republican convention, and I saw you and my friends at Code Pink. I saw you protesting. I heard many Americans were out there protesting. I heard many Americans got arrested. You are brave. You are brave women. You give activism a human face, and you show another face of America. And America desperately needs another face, and that is why I love you. Thank you very much.
Medea Benjamin, thank you. We're about to, thanks again, Medea, for stirring us, stirring our hearts and our minds and our spirits.
Is she receiving questions?
Stephen, want to have a few minutes for questions? Would you? Thank you.
Yes.
How do we leverage our energy in the next 6 weeks? You know, do we go to Philadelphia? Do we go to the swing states? You know, what do we do? How do we use the media? How do we use the internet? What are the best strategies that you know in the next 6 weeks?
Well, I think that we all have some differences of opinion, and interesting to hear the last panel. I was also protesting at the Democratic Convention. I'm so angry at Kerry for not taking the right position on this war. But I cannot imagine another 4 years of George Bush, and I am determined to do whatever I can in the next 6 weeks. And I think the most important thing, because of our ridiculous, horrible electoral system that only a couple of states matter, that yes, we have to go to the swing states. And we at Code Pink are focusing on Florida because it's such a key state. And because we already know that the groundwork is made, as they said in the Miami Herald the other day, to make Florida be the next Florida. And anybody who has any time who wants to join us, Code Pink in Florida, we will not only be registering people to vote, organizing people, getting out the vote, but we will be protesting every time George Bush and Dick Cheney go to Florida. And we will be organizing something else that I think is really important. And I would say all the swing states are important. But we also have to think what happens on November 3rd. And that's something really serious, because how many people think that it is very likely that the Bush administration will steal this election? Okay, almost unanimous here. What are we going to do? And so we have to be organizing for November 3rd. And this is just starting to get off the ground now because people have been so consumed by the voter registration, the voter education, the swing state strategy. We have to get people organized for November 3rd. And that's one of the focuses that Code Pink will have, which will be to start spreading through the internet virally and other ways a pledge that people will take to come out on the streets and make our cities ungovernable if this election is stolen. And I think we've got to be very, very prepared for that, particularly in places like Florida. So I would say yes, go to Nevada, go to New Mexico, go to Ohio, go to swing states. And there are excellent groups that you've probably talked about today that go from ACT, Americans Coming Together, to Move On, to Driving Votes, to anybody else want to yell out the names of some of the groups? True Majority, Wellstone. So there are lots of groups to hook up with, but I say yes, let's get out to the swing states. I also think, there are side benefits in all of this. One, we build our own organizations as we go out and talk and educate. And two, we learn how to talk to people. Because when you're from the Bay Area, you forget what the rest of the world is seeing and thinking and hearing unless you turn on Fox News from time to time. And we have to change the way we talk if we're going to reach people. So I think it's just even good for ourselves to get out there and talk to people in front of malls and in front of their salons where they get their manicures, even when we think it's ridiculous to get a manicure. Whatever, we've got to be there and talk to people in a language they can understand.
Thanks. Let's have maybe one more question. I actually have a question if there's no one else. Medea, I want to thank you on behalf of our national coalition, 911truth.org, for being here and also for being right there on the homepage of the website of 911truth.org as a supporter of the 9/11 Truth movement. And I wonder if you just have a few words to say about 9/11 itself and how that becomes a lever for the work that we're doing and our issue here that we're considering with complicity with 9/11's perpetration.
Well, I want to thank you for what you're doing, and I think it's the hardest job to be doing in this country today because it certainly is the biggest cover-up. And somebody was just going to ask Joanna Macy about Bill Moyers last night. Is there something you wanted to mention that he said?
I didn't see it.
Oh, okay, yeah.
I just heard that he said, did you see it? That he said that that it was a lie.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted I didn't think it was the greatest piece last night, but I thought that it was pretty amazing that he did say that, and that this is seen by many millions of Americans. Yeah, and the coverage on the website is much better, actually, than the show itself was. And so I think you are doing an amazing job of trying to now, reach into more mainstream media. This is the biggest issue. If we don't know what happened on 9/11, how can we start uncovering all these other layers of lies? It is the big lie that then covers every single other lie. So I suppose I just want to thank you for all the work that you have been doing in trying to expose this. Thank you for talking about the issue that so few people want to talk about. Thank you for trying to pierce the biggest cover-up in our lifetimes. And I think that if we are able, in our lifetimes, to uncover the truth of 9/11, we will certainly be on the way to uncovering so many of the lies that form the military-industrial complex that this country is built on. And I suppose I just want to end by perhaps echoing what Jim Garrison was saying, but from a different vantage point. And that is a hopeful message about the global community. I think if you ask people around the globe what happened on 9/11, they're probably better informed than the American people are. There is a global community that has made extraordinary strides in their own countries, making their own countries more democratic, I just came recently from Venezuela when they had the referendum. And it was such an inspiring thing to be in a place where people took their politics so seriously, and where you saw that poor people who had benefited from a government's policies were absolutely determined not to see that slip away. And to see Latin America coming alive again. There was just a Latin American social forum in Quito where people from all over the continent came together and talked about the kind of changes they are making on the national level that are affecting the entire continent. And when we look at a country like Venezuela and we see why the Bush administration so wanted to overthrow the Chavez regime, it wasn't because Chavez was using the oil money to benefit the poor people of Venezuela. It's that Venezuela is a rich country now that oil is over $50 a barrel and can help the people throughout the continent to make changes in their government and help to actually form a continent-wide movement. And that is something that is terrifying to the Bush administration. When you see what is happening globally, it is very, very inspiring. And just as you locally are doing things like trying to have Marin be GMO-free or Butte County GMO-free, so there are entire nations that have been fighting the invasion of GMO. And they're doing it entirely from the grassroots of millions of farmers. When you see these kind of grassroots movement, it gives you tremendous inspiration. And we in this country are playing catch up in terms of building a democracy in this country. Global Exchange is bringing in international observers starting tomorrow. They're coming in from 20 different countries and will be going around the United States from now until the election time to tell us how we could have a better democracy in this country. And we sure need the advice. But just as we have election observers coming in, we also need to hear from our brothers and sisters around the world who are doing so much of a better job than us, uncovering the lies that their governments tell. And not only uncovering the lies, not only protesting what their governments are doing against the will of the people, but actually overthrowing governments that refuse to work on behalf of the people and the environment. So let us, when we are feeling so discouraged by the state of politics in this country, or by our inability to get the truth out, let us remember that we are part of a growing, vibrant, incredibly beautiful global movement that is making strides towards building a global revolution, and we will be there and part of that global revolution. Thank you.
By the way, Medea, your website address is? CodePinkAlert.org and GlobalExchange.org. And with some flyers out here for Code Pink. Also, a couple of announcements before we break. The discussion we had about having a 9/11 intensive tomorrow has borne fruit, and there will be a 9/11 intensive tomorrow. So I have put out the flyers. They're in the blue tray on the main table, telling you how to get to Sunrise Center, 1:30 tomorrow with Jim Mars and Ken Jenkins and myself and possibly others. Please come and join us for our 9/11 intensive. Also, I wanted to invite Ted, if you can get up here, to say just a few words. Ted is doing real-time recording, and we'd like to make his recordings available. Why don't you go ahead and tell us about it?
Sure. You know, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ted St. Rain, and I travel around the country basically videotaping conferences just like this one. So I have a whole bunch of other conferences, probably 300 or 400 titles altogether on the table over here. They're all $15 a piece or $12 if you buy them in quantity. We also have the tapes from these lectures available, and they're $15 a piece. Same deal in quantity, about $12. And if anybody would be interested, I'd really appreciate it because it cost me a lot to do this. So anybody who's interested, just come see me later. And with that, I think we'll take a break.
We're going to take a 10-minute break and come back. Please, please come back. We have some very good entertainers who've been waiting for hours. And don't miss the what's coming up, humor, healing, entertainment. Also, I wanted to announce about GMO-free Marin.org. GMO-free Marin.org. They need help. See Laura right here.